right. In this lesson, I'm going to address some questions that were asked about the use of the money of a local church and how it should be used and what's right and wrong. And I'll do the best I can. Some of these questions are a little bit difficult to give a very definite answer to, but some of them are not that difficult either. So when we talk about the local church and use of money, one of the terms that often comes up is the term liberal or conservative. And so one of the questions that was asked is, what is the difference between liberals and conservatives? When we talk about the word liberal in the broad area of Christianity, so that's denominational people, anybody who claims to follow Christ, they would consider a liberal person to be those that deny miracles, that deny the resurrection, that deny the inspiration of the Bible as the Word of God. Those are what are generally considered to be liberals in the broader area of so-called Christianity. But among Christians that I know, it generally has a more specific idea, and that is those that are not careful to make sure they have authority for what they're doing. So they may be Christians, they may have obeyed the gospel of Christ, they believe in the resurrection, they believe the inspiration of the Bible and all of that, but they are doing things that they cannot establish authority for. They're not doing everything in the name of Christ, essentially. And because it's such a broad term, it's not always that helpful. If we say someone's a liberal, or they are liberal, we need to say in what way they are liberal. They might have women preachers or elders and be liberal in that way. That's clearly unauthorized. They may use the money of the church in ways that the Lord did not authorize, or they could be doing any other thing that's not in keeping with the teaching of Christ. But one thing to understand about this is that it's from the perspective of the person using the term liberal. So it may be that some people would consider me to be a liberal if they don't believe in churches having Bible classes, and I do believe that there's scriptural authority for it, and I can show why I believe it, but that doesn't convince everyone. And so they would say, no, you don't have authority for that, and therefore you are a liberal. Or for using multiple cups in the Lord's Supper instead of just one cup, because they misunderstand the whole point of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And so if we have a certain perspective, maybe we have a misunderstanding about something, we may consider others to be liberal, even though maybe they actually do have authority for what they're doing, but we don't understand that. And so we need to be careful with the term liberal and just understand that it's usually more helpful to talk about the specific thing in which we believe they're being liberal, that they're going outside the authority of Christ. A more specific term that's more helpful in general is the term institutional, and that's related to this idea liberal. And this is a term that relates to churches operating or financially supporting organizations or institutions that are separate from the church. That could be church-supported or overseen universities or other schools, like the Southern African Bible College, that's overseen by elders of a church in Texas and America and supported by churches all over South Africa, as well as in America, I believe. And it could be orphan homes that are overseen by a church or supported by churches, or old age homes or camps for children or any other type of organization that's separate from the church that is run by or supported by churches. And so they are institutions, separate institutions. Therefore, the churches that participate in that are institutional churches, or those that refuse to participate in it, the sometimes called conservative churches, are the non-institutional churches. Since there's no authority for the church to be involved in the operation or support of such organizations, it's incorporated into the term liberal. And usually when I have heard the term liberal, that's what people have meant by it most often, that they are institutional. But if you are liberal in one area, you tend to become liberal over time in other areas. In other words, if you don't demand authority from Christ in one particular part of what you do, well, then why should you demand authority in another area? If you think that it's a good thing, you just do it, not requiring our King to actually authorize it. So this term liberal is related to doing things without authority, and often it is talking about institutionalism or supporting things out of the church treasury, that the church is supporting things that are not authorized by Christ for the church to be involved in. And conservative often is referring to those that are non-institutional, those that would stand against the churches doing those things, but also refusing to have women leadership of the church, especially speaking in the church, or having elders that are women, things like that, which are very clear in the teaching of Christ that that's not authorized. But anyway, those are some of the things in which the terms liberal and conservative are used. Again, maybe not the most helpful terms. In general, it's often more useful just to talk about the particular things that we have a problem with, that people are doing or churches are doing. All right, another question that we have, or a couple of questions, start off with, is it right for the church to use the collection to do something? All right, so before we get into the specific questions, let's just get a foundation for how do we figure this out. The funds of the church are to be used for the things that the church is supposed to do. I mean, that seems obvious, but that we need to make sure that we think this through. We don't just say, well, this is a good thing, therefore the church can support it. No, it's what are the things the church is supposed to do, the local church. That is what the funds of the local church should be used for. So evangelism, supporting preachers, and if there are resources needed for preaching, for evangelism, then the church can use the money for that. In Philippians chapter 4 and verses 15 through 17, Paul says, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account." So there's a couple of things in this passage. We know for sure he's talking about the church sending him support, because he says, no church shared with me except you only. Okay, so this was from the church, not just from the Christians there. And so they were sending him money to help him as he went around preaching. He says it's for my necessities. They were sending for him to live so that he could do this work. And he says it's not even that he was seeking that for himself, but he knew it was good for them, the fruit that abounds to your account. He knew it was good for them to do that. This is something that is good for the church, a local church, when they help a preacher to live and be able to do his work, have the necessities so that he can do the work of preaching the gospel. That is good for the local church when they do that. All right. Teaching, of course, that's very similar to evangelism, but the scriptures talk about it separately. And so teachers and resources needed for that can be supported. Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 13. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. You see that the evangelists and the teachers are separate, but all of them have a similar job. Verse 12, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So it's all towards equipping the saints. It's for the work of ministry, the edifying of the body of Christ. This is a work that is very important, and all the work that is done within the church for the good of the church can be supported by the church. If it's something that the church is supposed to be doing, if there is a need for financial aid to someone or the purchase of something for that thing to be done effectively for the work that God gave the local church to do, then the church is authorized to use the money for that. You can support those who serve the church in other ways, like elders and true widows who are placed on a list. In 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 5, it says, honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. She's doing something for the church. She is praying all the time. She is dedicated to this. And as you read through this passage, it seems like they make a commitment to do some work for the Lord here. And so if they desire to get married again, then they're breaking that commitment. But if they're younger widows, they should get married again. But that's why he says, don't put them on this list. Don't put them on the roll to be supported for the work that they're dedicated to do. So this idea of honoring the widows is actually financially supporting them, among other types of honor, I'm sure. But he contrasts that with if they have children or grandchildren, they should be taking care of them. They should honor them by supporting them. In verses 17 and 18, he says, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. So what we find here is that there's a general principle. This same passage is applied to evangelists in other places. The laborer is worthy of his wages. And here it's applied to elders. And so he's saying that those who work for the good of the church should be supported by the church, or at least they can be. They're worthy of that. It may be that they don't need it, and most of the elders I have known are not supported by the churches where they serve because they're financially stable. They don't need the church to support them for them to do that work. But it is absolutely appropriate for them to be supported by the churches for what they are doing. In Romans chapter 16 and verses 1 and 2, Paul says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For indeed she has been a helper of many and of myself also. So here he talks about this sister. He doesn't talk about exactly what she's doing, but he tells the church in Rome, you should assist her in whatever business she has need of you. This is something that she is worthy of. She's doing work for the Lord, and the church has the responsibility to support people in those things if they need assistance. Okay, so when we look at the work of the church in evangelism or in any other area where we know this is something the Lord wants done for the church has a responsibility to make sure the people doing that work can do that work, including supporting them financially if that is needed. We also know that the Lord expects the local churches to provide the physical needs of needy Christians, those that cannot provide their own needs, and even in other churches, sending to those churches so that they can provide for the needs of the needy Christians there if they can't do that otherwise. In Acts chapter 4, in verses 32 through 35, it says, Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. And let's just understand for sure that this does not say they distributed to each as anyone had a desire for that money, right? It wasn't just because they wanted it, it was that they needed it. If they were lacking something that was necessary, like food, clothing, things like that, then that would be provided for them if they could not provide it for themselves. That is something that Christians were doing from the very beginning. We get the idea that even on an individual level, they were helping one another, sharing what they had, but then they knew that there were other people that they were not so close to, that they might not interact with directly, but they could still help. So they gave that money to the apostles, in other words, to the church, and the apostles would distribute it. It was the church distributing to each as anyone had need. We find in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, in verses 13 through 15, Paul is talking about this collection for this poor saints in Jerusalem. And he's explaining the thought behind it. And he says, For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. So he says, now, here's the picture of what we're trying to accomplish. When someone has a lack, that means they're missing something necessary, right? Not just they don't have as nice of a car or as nice of a house or something. They don't have basic necessities. Then your abundance can supply their lack. And if it's the other way around, when you have a lack, you have something you are missing that is necessary, their abundance can supply that for you. It's not for some to have an easy life and others to be burdened because they're supporting them. That's not the idea. But it is just to take what you have more than what you need and provide that for those that don't have enough, which you can do on an individual level. You can help people as just a Christian, not as part of the local church. But in this case, because they were sending the money to other churches so that they could take care of Christians there that these people didn't even personally know, this was done as a church. The church in Corinth took up this collection every week, as we read in 1 Corinthians 16. And so we know that that is a use for the church's money. But basically, anything that the Lord has authorized the church to do as a church should be done, right? If we need to spend money to accomplish it, that money can come out of the treasury of the church. So one of the specific questions that was asked is it right for the church to use the collection to fund youth trips? And I asked for kind of a explanation of what a youth trip would be. And it seems like this is like teenagers who would go for a weekend somewhere to have fun and do Bible studies and spend time together, get to know each other well. So, I mean, it sounds like a good thing. But, of course, the question we've got to ask is, does it fit within the work Jesus gave the local church to do? All right, if this is entertainment, they're going to have fun. Well, that's not within the work of the church. Jesus didn't give that responsibility to the local church. It's the work of the family, so that must be funded by the family, not by the church. But now there's a question of fellowship, right? Is this fellowship that they're having? Doesn't the Bible talk a lot about fellowship? So what is fellowship? Fellowship means working together toward a common goal. So it's the idea of trying to accomplish something together. You're both trying to accomplish the same thing, and so you're working side by side, maybe doing different parts of it, but you're working together to accomplish the common goal. That's fellowship. We see that as we look through different passages that talk about fellowship in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, it says, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers." Now notice, it doesn't tell us very much specifically about fellowship here. What is this fellowship? But we can tell by the context that it's spiritual fellowship. This isn't talking about playing sports together. This isn't about going out and having a nice time and just getting to know each other. This is the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. This is a spiritual context. They're doing spiritual things here. And so this fellowship is spiritual. And we're going to see that idea most of the places that we see the word fellowship. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20, when he talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols, he says, "Rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons." He says, if you eat that food that's sacrificed to idols, while those gods are nothing, the idols are nothing, demons are real, and they actually are sacrificing these things to demons. So don't eat that meat, right? Because you're having fellowship with demons when you do that. Just because you may say, well, there's nothing to it, it's just good meat, I'll go to the temple and of these idols and eat that meat and enjoy it. but you're having fellowship with demons when you do that. This is a spiritual idea. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, he says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness?" Fellowship here, it's righteousness and lawlessness. They don't go together. They are not trying to accomplish a common goal. There is no fellowship there. Therefore, you should not have fellowship with unbelievers. In other words, don't be yoked together. How are you going to accomplish a common goal when you don't have a common goal, right? You can't be trying to join yourself with someone when you're trying to accomplish one thing and they're trying to accomplish something completely different. You can't have real fellowship that way. In 2 Corinthians 8, verses 3 and 4, he says, "For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints." He's talking here about the poor Macedonian churches that wanted to help the poorer Christians in Judea, Jerusalem area. So they even begged to be able to collect money and send that along with the other money that churches were sending. And he calls that fellowship, the fellowship of ministering to the saints. These churches were having fellowship with one another. But how were they having fellowship with one another? They weren't getting together and having entertainment. They weren't eating together. They were working towards a common goal. They were all collecting independently, collecting money that they would send by their own messengers, but they were trying to do something that was the same goal. They were all trying to help the same people, trying to accomplish the same ministry to these saints. And so it was fellowship. They were working towards this common goal. That's the idea of fellowship in the scriptures. In Galatians 2, verse 9, it says, "And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." Now here they're going to different groups of people, but they're trying to accomplish the same thing. They're preaching the same gospel. They are working together, even though they're not in the same place. And so they gave them the right hand of fellowship. They're working together towards a common goal. In Ephesians 5, verse 11, it says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them." Unfruitful works of darkness, sin, it does not help you accomplish what God wants you to accomplish. It does not help us in our goal of pleasing Christ. You don't have fellowship with them. If you have fellowship with them, you don't have fellowship with Christ. You can't be trying to accomplish both things at the same time. They're leading in completely different directions. Fellowship has to do with this work together. It has to do with a goal that you're trying to accomplish, and you're working together towards that goal. Philippians 1 verse 5 says, "For your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now." This is right in the middle of a statement, but just see that this idea of fellowship in the gospel. This isn't about getting together and eating. This isn't about entertainment. This is about the gospel. This is about working together and helping one another, supporting. This is them supporting Paul to be able to preach the gospel. Remember, the Philippians were the ones that helped him in giving and receiving, so that they provided for his needs as he preached the gospel. And that was having fellowship in the gospel. In Philippians 3, verse 10, It says that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. We're working together with Christ in his sufferings. When we suffer like he suffered, we're trying to accomplish the same type of work in helping to save people that he was working to accomplish. We have fellowship with him. In 1 John 1, verses 1 through 3, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us, that which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. He's writing to them. He's writing these things down so that those who would read and understand would have fellowship with them. They may never be with them physically. Fellowship does not require ever laying eyes on a person to have fellowship with them. Okay, you can have fellowship with all Christians that have ever lived because you have the same faith, you have the same desire, the same goals, and you're working towards that just like they have been working towards that. That is the fellowship in Christ. All right, so we can't use the term fellowship to justify spending the church's money for get-togethers, like these youth trips. Youth trips, like youth camps or anything like that, if they're done well, those are good things. I'm not saying that those are bad to do at all. But just like educating your children, providing them with opportunities for good friends, feeding your children, it's the responsibility of parents, not the church, to fund their children going on trips like that. Now, it doesn't mean other people can't help if they choose to do so, but it's nobody's responsibility but the parents if they choose to send their children on trips like that. And family responsibilities are very separate from church responsibilities. And that's made clear, especially in 1 Timothy 5:16, when it talks about taking care of those widows or putting widows on the list, the ones that are true widows. But it says here in verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So he says, now, if you have a mother or grandmother who's a widow, it's your responsibility, not the church's responsibility, to take care of them. Even if they're needy Christians, right? The first responsibility of taking care of needy Christians are family members of those Christians, if they're also Christians especially. If they're capable of doing it, if they're capable of taking care of their family members, that's their responsibility, not the church's. Okay, so the same thing applies with youth trips or other things like that. If this is a good thing to do and you want to do it, don't burden the church with it. It's the family's responsibility to fund that themselves. That is not the work of the church. We don't find anything like that in what Christ tells the local church to do. A very similar question, but we'll look at it a little bit differently. But another question is it right for the church to use the collection to fund buying food when brethren are visiting each other from house to house? All right, so now this isn't just, your children going somewhere for fun. This may be getting together for Bible studies or different things like that, and there's food involved. All right, so it may be that a justification for that is what's found in Acts 2, verse 44 through 47, where it says, "Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all, as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved." All right, so we find that we've got these believers. All who believed were together. They were selling their possessions and their goods. Now, just notice there that that is not the church doing it. The church doesn't sell things. These are the individuals who are members of the church selling their possessions and goods. And then we find in chapter 4 what we already looked at, that they were bringing them to the apostles, that what was the proceeds, bringing them to the apostles, and the apostles would divide it to anyone who had need. But then it says they were continuing daily with one accord in the temple. That seems to be where the church was meeting, was in the temple. They had thousands of members of the church. From the first day, they had 3,000, and it kept growing from there. And the temple provided them a place where they could all meet together. And then they were also breaking bread from house to house. But the question is this breaking bread from house to house something that was done as a church, or was it done as individuals? And I think if we understand that there are thousands of people in the church, it can't be the church doing it, right? There's a reason why they're breaking bread from house to house and not breaking bread in the temple. In the temple, that's where the church is meeting, but that's not where they are eating. They're eating at home, and they're getting together. They are breaking bread from house to house, and they're in their homes, and it seems like they're getting together to eat. But is that the church doing it? Well, just like those who believed sold their possessions and goods, and that's not the church doing it. Those are members of the church, and once they give the proceeds to the church, then it's the church who distributes it. But not everything in this passage is done as a church. Some of this is done as individual Christians who are members of a local church, but not everything that members of a local church do is the church doing it, as is very clear from the passage we just looked at in 1 Timothy 5:16. These are members of a local church, but them taking care of their widows is not the church doing it. All right, so does this fit the work that Christ gave the local church? All right, these get-togethers in different homes and eating together. All right, now if there are teachers that are teaching the Bible in these homes, they can be supported by the church, because teachers are something that are provided by Christ, right? That is something that supporting preachers and teachers, that's a work Christ gave the church to do. If that's needed, they can certainly do that. And if people are needy and they need assistance with transportation to get to a Bible study, the church can assist with that, right? I think it might be wiser for individuals to see if they can handle getting people to those Bible studies first. But especially if these are things that the church has decided they're going to do, even if it's in people's homes, and then they can certainly help with the transportation cost. But when we talk about food that's provided to those that are not needy Christians has nothing to do with the work of the church. Or perhaps we could say also those that are doing the work for the church, but that's also providing needs, right? But if we're just talking about getting together and socializing, that's not part of the work of the church. Socializing is important, and it's something we should do as individuals with one another, but it's not the work of the church. The work of the church is restricted to spiritual matters or physical needs. And socializing and just getting together to eat because we want to is not a need. That's not a physical need. That is not something that Christ has taught us that the church is supposed to be doing. And so for the collection to be used to provide food just because people are getting together to spend time together or even have a Bible study, that's not appropriate. That's outside the teaching of Christ. That's outside the authority that Christ has given us, at least as far as I can see. I've never heard anybody who has presented the authority for it. Maybe there's someone who can, but I don't see that authority. Can the collection be used to fund a church building? So this is another question that was asked. And when we talk about that, we ask the same question. Does it fit the work Christ gave the local church? All right, meeting together is a clear part of the work of the local church. So there has to be a place to meet that's arranged by the church. If nobody has a home large enough for the church to meet in, which, that's something we certainly find in the scriptures often. Churches were meeting in houses, but sometimes a church is too large to meet in someone's house. A place must be provided somehow that's separate from what the individuals can provide. If you can't provide a place on your own, as an individual, then the whole church is going to have to provide a place, right, for the church to meet. So the church is going to have to make a decision about whether they meet outside. I think some churches do that. They can meet under a tree in some areas, but it may not always be a viable choice. Maybe there's a public venue available, like the temple was for the Christians in Acts chapter 2. Or maybe they need to rent a location or buy a location for the church to meet. And so we've got to use a lot of wisdom in this decision, and we've got to understand that all of the options have problems as well as advantages. And so we need to do what we believe best helps us fulfill Christ's plan for the local church where we are. The church in one place may make a completely different choice than a church in another place because of their situation being different. But we need to look at the situation where we are, the church where we are, and if the decision is made, and hopefully through wisdom and good spiritual thinking, that the church needs to buy a church building, they believe that is the most effective way of fulfilling the command of Christ to meet together and do these things that will build up the brethren. Then, if it's something that the church is supposed to do, it is authorized by Christ to do it, right? There has to be a meeting place. So there doesn't have to be a church building, right? There doesn't. You can meet at a different place every week if that's how the church arranges it. There doesn't. I don't know that that's wise, but it can be done, and in some areas maybe that is wise. But we have to understand that if that is the decision that the brethren make, and it's based on good wisdom and spiritual thinking that we need a building, then it's authorized to use the church's collection to fund that, because it's the work of the church, right? It is something the church has to do. And so if the church is to do it, then the collection taken by the church for the work of the church should be used to do that. All right. And then a related question is it wrong to eat in the church building during gospel meetings? All right, so I'm going to start off saying I don't like eating in the church building during gospel meetings. I have done it quite a few times. And so that hopefully tells you I don't believe it's wrong, but I don't like it. But that's from a wisdom perspective and what I'm used to as well. But we'll talk about some of the reasons I don't like it later. But we have to ask the question, does it fit the work Christ gave the local church, eating in the church building? Because now we're using church property, right? So the church building belongs to the church, or if it's rented, then it's still under the control of the church. All right, so if it's something that the church should be doing, it's right to use the location used by the church to do it. Okay, if it's something that it's right for the church to do, if it's right for the church to eat together, let's say, as a church, then it's right to use the church building to do that, right? There's nothing wrong with it if that's something Christ wants the church to do. But in the case of eating at gospel meetings, eating together, not outside of the Lord's Supper, is not something the local church should be doing. We do not eat together as churches. That's actually forbidden in 1 Corinthians 11, right? If you're hungry, eat at home. You don't eat together as a church except for the Lord's Supper. But it's something that individuals or families are responsible for, right? Eating your food, that's a individual level or family level responsibility, not a church responsibility. And when we talk about gospel meetings, if some of the individuals decide to feed those who come to the meeting, that's fine. Yeah, it fits within the authority Christ has given them, not the church, but just individual Christians. They say, hey, we're going to have people coming. They're going to be hungry, and we live here, so we can cook for them. We can provide some food for them. And we want to do that. Well, that's a good thing to do. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But it's not the church that should do that. And there are certain things that are done by individuals in a location that are incidental. And this means that it's not the purpose of the location, but they're not wrong to do. For instance, if somebody brings water to drink during church services, well, the individual's doing that. It's not the church, getting together to drink water. But there's nothing wrong with it being done in the church building, right? You can do things as an individual in the church building. In fact, you can even socialize in the church building, can't you? You can, before services start, you can talk to your brethren and talk about what's going on in the world around, and hopefully bring it down to some spiritual ideas, but you're socializing, right? That's not the purpose of the church building, but it's not wrong to do it just because you're in the church building. That's not why you came, but while you're there, it's not wrong to talk about things, just to visit. Okay, so that's the idea of there are some incidental things. It's not the purpose of it, but if individuals do it while they're there, it's really not a problem. And if people are eating food at the building, in order to allow more time for everyone being there for more teaching and preaching, because they don't have to go away and find food, and take all that time to do that and then come back. Well, it's not the purpose of the building. I say it may be allowable. I believe it's allowable, or I wouldn't do it. And I do it when I'm at gospel meetings, and that's where people provide food. I eat it, and I believe it's okay. But here's why I don't like it. The visual of eating there at the church building can confuse a lot of people. They start thinking that it's the church providing the food, which is wrong. The churches should not be providing the food. And they think that eating together is somehow connected with the work of the church, which it's not. It's just there so that you can be better prepared, right, for more studying. You eat and then you go on. But it's not the church's work to provide food. It's not the church's work to eat together. And so when you do it in the building, it kind of gets it into people's minds a lot of time that it's actually something the church is doing, not just individuals that happen to be in the church building when they do it. And this is the same problem whether it's in the church building, like a building owned by the church, or in a facility rented by the church. So I know sometimes churches will rent a facility that has a kitchen area so that the Christians who want to provide food for people can do that. And it's still under the church's control. So anything done with the property is under the authority of the church. I don't believe it's wrong for the church to allow individuals to use a space, to provide food for visiting brethren or whoever during a gospel meeting. But I do think it can be problematic, especially in how it causes people to think about it. I believe it's an incidental use of the building, and it allows for shorter breaks for food so people don't go out and find food. So I believe it's okay. But, there are alternatives as well. People could just go eat in their cars food that they brought, or, somebody might bring some sandwiches and share that with people, right? You don't have to eat meat. There's no requirement. You can just bring sandwiches and go out and eat in your cars during a break. And you can even skip a break for food entirely. Jesus spoke for a long time without any food break, and the 5,000 people ate when he was finished. We could do that too. And we need to be mindful that the authority for this is not as clear as for some other things, right? And it might bother the conscience of some brethren. And in our planning for things, we need to accommodate that. I believe it's better not to do it at all at the church building personally, but obviously I don't have control over what different churches decide to do with that. But I do believe we need to be really thoughtful about, if is this going to bother somebody's conscience if we allow individuals to provide food at the building, not inviting people over to their house or something like that, where it's clear that this is not the church doing it. One of the things that can help with that as well is just announcing, having somebody announce that this is not the church doing it, that this is provided by so-and-so, different individuals, different families. And so that can be helpful. I know the Maydells used to do that and always make it clear when they had lectures at their houses. But another question that was asked, is it wrong to give money from the church treasury to brethren after they have lost their loved ones or close relatives? So again, we're going to ask the same question, but first let's just read a verse. In Acts chapter 8, in verses 1 and 2, right after Stephen is stoned to death, it says, "Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him." I want you to notice here that it says devout men, not the church, right? The church did not bury Stephen, even though if anybody deserved to be buried by the church, Stephen did, right? But the church did not bury Stephen. It wasn't his family, though, either here. It was devout men. So some of the other Christians who loved Stephen, they took care of his burial, apparently. And that's okay. You can see even with Jesus, people who were not his family took care of his burial, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, right? So it doesn't have to be a family who does it, but it's never the church, okay? So does it fit the work Christ gave the local church? Burying people is something families or individuals do, not local churches. We do not bury people. Funerals are not a church function. You don't get that in the scriptures at all. So if the person who died was the provider for the family, and now those who are left are needy Christians, then the church should ensure that they have food, right? That's because they're needy Christians, not just because somebody died. The church is not responsible for feeding all the people who come to the funeral, right? That's the big expense, I think, at most of the funerals, is feeding people. And that's not even the family's responsibility, right? Nobody's responsible to feed all those people. But if they decide to do that because of pressure, because of culture, whatever, well, that's their burden, not the church's burden. Okay? And the church should not be giving them money to help them with that. That is not the church's responsibility. The cost of burying might be more than a brother can handle, and so fellow brethren should be thoughtful and helpful in those things. And I suppose even if it's somebody who's a needy Christian and they need to bury somebody, that's their responsibility, and they can't afford to the basic burial things, the church could help them with that, I believe. But even then, surely fellow brethren could just step up and help them and not burden the church with it. But the church's treasury is only for the things Christ gave the local church to do. It's not for burying people. And we need to understand that in all aspects, right? In all areas, the church treasury is only for the things Christ gave the local church to do. And we need to understand those things properly. We need to understand what fellowship is in a scriptural use. It's not getting together to socialize. That is not fellowship that the church is to do. It is just getting together to eat. That's not the work of the church at all. So the church shouldn't fund such things. We need to be careful that it's not just about being careful not to break the law of Christ. Obviously, we do want to be careful not to break the law of Christ. But we need to be careful to be doing the things that Christ wants us to do. We need to be thinking, what is it Christ gave the church to do? And what did he give me as an individual to do? What is my responsibility? What is the church's responsibility? And if we understand our responsibilities well, then we'll be much more effective in serving Christ and doing those things that he wants us to do. So that I might not have answered all of these questions to your satisfaction, but I hope that was helpful at least. Thank you.